For millennia, the Galactic Union had remained passive observers of Earth's affairs. The Council, composed of the most advanced civilizations in the known universe, had long debated whether interference in primitive species was justifiable. Their guiding philosophy was simple: civilizations must evolve at their own pace, overcoming their flaws through trial and error. But Earth had proven to be an anomaly, an outlier in the grand equation of societal development. Humanity's history was a perpetual cycle of destruction and rebuilding. No matter how much progress it made in science, medicine, or technology, war remained an inevitable constant. Empires had risen and crumbled, entire cultures had been erased, and countless millions had perished. All in the name of power, ideology, or survival. The Architects of Order, an elite division of the Union tasked with evaluating planetary stability, had spent centuries compiling data on Earth's trajectory. Each time they ran the simulations, the results were the same. War would persist indefinitely, with only brief interludes of peace before the cycle resumed. At the center of the council chamber, a massive holographic display projected Earth's recorded history. Wars, revolutions, coups, and genocides flashed in rapid succession. It was a testament to humanity's resilience, but also to its self-destructive tendencies. The assembled representatives studied the data in silence. Finally, the head architect, Zalvorin, stepped forward. His species had achieved peace over 10,000 years ago, eradicating internal conflict through a meticulously designed societal structure. He had witnessed countless civilizations rise and fall, but none had frustrated him as much as Earth's inhabitants. This species, Zalvorin said, gesturing toward the chaotic stream of images, has demonstrated remarkable ingenuity. It possesses intelligence, adaptability, and an unparalleled capacity for innovation. And yet, it remains tethered to its most primitive instincts. If we do not intervene, the wars will never cease. A murmur spread through the chamber. Intervention was a dangerous precedent. Every species had struggled through its own turbulent past before reaching enlightenment. To interfere was to deny a civilization the opportunity to evolve on its own. But the data was undeniable. Unlike other species, humans did not appear to learn from their mistakes in a meaningful way. Every era was marked by new conflicts that mirrored those of the past, only with more advanced weaponry and deadlier consequences. Earth is on the verge of achieving space travel beyond its own solar system, another architect, Drelker, pointed out. If it brings war into the stars, the consequences will be catastrophic, not just for them, but for others. That was the crucial factor. The Union had tolerated Earth's internal conflicts under the assumption that it would remain isolated. But humanity was progressing faster than expected. The moment it gained the ability to reach other civilizations, its destructive tendencies would no longer be contained. Direct intervention will only lead to resistance, Zalvorin continued. Their species is fiercely independent. If we impose peace upon them, they will reject it. They must believe they achieved it themselves. A silence settled over the chamber as the architects absorbed his words. The proposal was unprecedented. No civilization had ever been restructured from within without realizing it. "How do you propose we accomplish this?" one of the representatives asked. Zalvorin turned to the display and activated a new projection. A series of intricate networks appeared, depicting Earth's economic systems, military infrastructures, political alliances, and global conflicts. "We will not give them peace," he said. "We will engineer a system in which war becomes impossible, not by force but through careful, undetectable alterations to their world." It was a bold strategy. Instead of imposing peace, they would remove the conditions that made war viable. If resources were abundant, wars over scarcity would disappear. If corruption was rendered ineffective, leaders would no longer have incentives to manipulate conflicts for power. If military advancements became unsustainable, nations would shift their focus to diplomacy. It would take time, but once the foundations were laid, peace would self-perpetuate. "Phase 1 will begin with observation," Zalvorin explained. We must understand their society on a microscopic level. Every decision, every movement, every variable must be accounted for. The architects activated their most sophisticated surveillance technology. Thousands of microscopic probes, undetectable to human instruments, were released into Earth's atmosphere. These probes infiltrated satellites, communication networks, financial institutions, and military command centers. They did not interfere, yet. They simply observed, gathering terabytes of data every second. Months passed as the architects compiled their findings. The more they studied humanity, the more patterns emerged. They identified the key figures whose influence dictated the course of global events. They mapped the root causes of war, not just political tensions, but the economic structures that fueled them. They uncovered the subtle mechanisms through which misinformation spread, turning populations against each other. Then, at last, the architects had everything they needed. "It is time," Exelvorin declared. The next phase would begin. Not with weapons, not with ultimatums, but with the careful manipulation of Earth's most fundamental systems. Humanity would never realize what had been done. It would believe it had solved its own problems. And that was exactly how the architects intended it. The architects of order had spent decades perfecting their observational models of Earth. Their vast network of undetectable probes, hidden within the planet's digital infrastructure, had mapped every aspect of human society down to its most intricate details. The patterns were clear now, and the time for observation had ended. The intervention would begin, not with a grand display of power, nor with an overt restructuring of human civilization. The change would come silently, like an imperceptible shift in the tide, nudging humanity toward a future where war would no longer be possible. The architects did not believe in brute force. To impose peace was to plant the seeds of rebellion. If humanity suspected interference, it would resist with everything it had. But if the change unfolded naturally, if humans believed they were responsible for their own transformation, the peace would be permanent. The challenge lay in reshaping the foundations of conflict without anyone realizing it. Exelvorin stood within the architect's command chamber, watching as the Earth's global systems played out in real time before him. Financial transactions, government communications, military mobilizations, all of it streamed into the chamber's projection fields, forming an intricate, ever-shifting web. His team had already identified the key pressure points, the places where the smallest shifts could ripple outward, altering the course of nations without drawing attention. The first phase targeted communication networks. Humanity had long relied on misinformation as a weapon, twisting facts to justify aggression, fabricating threats to incite fear, distorting truth until war became the inevitable conclusion. The architects could not eliminate deception entirely. Human nature was too deeply entwined with its survival instincts. But they could make it ineffective. With a single command, the architects activated the first sequence of modifications. The changes were microscopic, subtle to the point of invisibility. The probes embedded in Earth's digital systems adjusted algorithms, redirecting information flow in ways that seemed perfectly natural. False reports lost credibility before they could spread. Manipulated media failed to gain traction. Military propaganda campaigns collapsed as their inconsistencies became glaringly obvious to the public. No one noticed. Governments accused their own intelligence agencies of incompetence. News networks scrambled to explain why their audience engagement had shifted so drastically. Conspiracy theorists, once able to stoke division with ease, found themselves shouting into the void. The changes had begun. Next came the financial sector. The architects had long identified economic instability as a driving force behind human conflict. Wars were waged not for ideology, but for control of resources, of markets, of power structures built on scarcity and competition. This too could be altered. The architects' probes infiltrated the world's banking institutions, stock exchanges, and digital transaction networks. They did not steal or erase wealth. Such an approach would be too obvious. Instead, they introduced microscopic fluctuations in financial systems, imperceptible shifts in market behavior that redirected capital flows in new directions. Nations that relied on military conflict to sustain their economies found their industries quietly failing. Arms manufacturers saw contracts inexplicably delayed, production chains subtly disrupted. Meanwhile, investments in infrastructure, technology, and humanitarian efforts surged, seemingly of their own accord. Wealth began to consolidate in areas that encouraged stability rather than aggression. Corrupt officials discovered that their usual methods of laundering money no longer functioned as expected. Black market arms deals collapsed before they could be finalized, funds vanishing into bureaucratic dead ends. Human traffickers and warlords found themselves suddenly, inexplicably bankrupt. And yet, there was no single event that could be traced to a foreign influence. The world economy was simply shifting as though by its own design. Zalvorin observed the results with careful precision. The adjustments were working, but they had to be gradual. If the shift was too sudden, if entire industries collapsed overnight, humanity would notice and panic. The change needed to appear organic, the result of human decisions rather than an external force. The next phase, targeted military operations. The architects had no interest in dismantling Earth's armed forces entirely. Humanity was not ready for such a drastic step. But war needed to become unfeasible. The architects' probes infiltrated targeting systems, weapons guidance protocols, and tactical coordination networks, introducing minuscule inconsistencies. Missile guidance software developed inexplicable errors, causing high-level military strategists to lose confidence in their capabilities. Advanced weapons systems required constant recalibration, delaying deployments indefinitely. Communications between Allied forces encountered untraceable disruptions, forcing delays in response times. At the same time, defensive technologies inexplicably improved. Radar detection became more efficient, cyber defenses adapted faster than attackers could breach them, and missile interception rates skyrocketed. With every passing month, military aggression became more and more costly, while diplomatic negotiations yielded increasingly favorable results. Governments, unaware of the unseen influence, began shifting their priorities. Treaties were signed not because of ideological shifts, but because the alternatives had simply stopped being viable. Exelvorin watched as global leaders unknowingly played their parts in the architect's grand design. Nations once on the brink of war found their tensions diffused through a series of seemingly random bureaucratic hurdles and logistical failures. Corrupt politicians attempting to manipulate war efforts found themselves suddenly exposed through anonymous leaks that could never be traced. Generals planning invasions found their supply chains inexplicably unreliable. The changes were subtle but irreversible. Yet, despite all their progress, Zalvorin knew there was still much to be done. War had not yet been eradicated, only hindered. The final phase would be the most delicate, reshaping human perception itself. If humanity did not evolve beyond its reliance on conflict, it would eventually find ways to adapt to the disruptions. The cycle could still return. For the first time in his long existence, Exalvorn felt something almost akin to anticipation. The experiment was working. The intervention was succeeding. But the next steps would determine whether this fragile peace could truly become permanent. The architects would continue their work. Silence was their greatest weapon. Humanity would never suspect a thing. The subtle shifts in Earth's infrastructure were already showing results. But Exalvorin knew that without dismantling the core economic structures that had sustained warfare for millennia, the project would remain incomplete. The military disruptions and information recalibrations had weakened the world's ability to wage war, but as long as human economies thrived on power struggles, corruption, and artificial scarcity, peace could not be sustained. The architects had to ensure that war would not simply become unfeasible, but also unprofitable. The greatest challenge lay in the human financial system itself. Unlike advanced civilizations which had long abandoned material-based economies in favor of resource efficiency and strategic equilibrium, humanity clung to a primitive model of wealth accumulation. Nations hoarded resources, corporations engineered scarcity to maximize profits, and industries thrived on controlled instability. The architects did not need to eliminate capitalism or alter humanity's understanding of value. Doing so would raise suspicions. Instead, they would redirect the flow of capital in ways that made war a financial liability rather than an opportunity. Zalvoren stood before the intricate network of projections mapping the global financial landscape. He watched as stock markets fluctuated, currency exchanges dictated geopolitical power, and corporate interests influenced the decisions of entire governments. If war was to be undone, its benefactors had to be removed from positions of influence, and industries that thrived on destruction had to be rendered obsolete. The intervention began at the highest levels of economic control. The architects' probes, already embedded in the planet's banking networks and corporate mainframes, initiated the first sequence of changes. Stock algorithms were adjusted, leading investment patterns to shift gradually over time. Industries that relied on military contracts found their market value declining, not through force, but through a carefully engineered loss of confidence. Investors, unaware of the invisible hand guiding their decisions, began pulling resources from arms manufacturers and defense contractors, redirecting funds towards sectors that promoted long-term stability, renewable energy, infrastructure development, and medical research. Military budgets, once considered untouchable, faced unprecedented scrutiny as corruption leaks surfaced with increasing frequency. Politicians who had built their careers on war economies found themselves exposed in ways that no intelligence agency could trace, their financial dealings laid bare before the public. Zalvoren studied the results as they unfolded. Governments struggled to adapt to the new reality. Nations that had once dominated global conflicts found their influence diminishing as their economic models collapsed. Without war to fuel their industries, their economies stagnated, forcing them to seek alternative avenues for financial stability. The shift was slow, almost imperceptible, but irreversible. The architects turned their attention to the banking sector next. Centralized wealth, particularly in nations that had long used financial power as a weapon, had to be redistributed without triggering panic. The challenge was ensuring that no single entity could monopolize the new economic balance. Instead of seizing control directly, the architects manipulated inflation rates, interest structures, and financial policy regulations, ensuring that capital flowed toward stabilization efforts rather than military expenditures. To the human population, these changes appeared as nothing more than an economic evolution. New trade agreements emerged, structured in ways that disincentivized aggression. Supply chains diversified, making resource control ineffective as a geopolitical strategy. Financial institutions unknowingly prioritized long-term investments over short-term war profits, believing they were responding to market conditions rather than an unseen force shaping their decisions. But the most crucial element of the reset was the dismantling of corruption itself. The architects had long identified systemic corruption as one of the greatest barriers to peace. Power was not held by the strongest nations or the wealthiest corporations, but by those who controlled information and manipulated financial flows to maintain dominance. Wars were rarely fought for noble causes. They were orchestrated in backroom deals, their true motives hidden behind layers of deception. If the cycle was to be broken, these mechanisms had to be dismantled. The architects' probes had spent years compiling data on Earth's most influential figures: corporate executives, government officials, banking moguls, those who dictated the course of global events from the shadows. With precision, the architects launched the next phase of their operation. Encrypted financial records were decrypted and leaked anonymously to investigative journalists. Offshore accounts were exposed, revealing illicit transactions and hidden alliances. Corruption scandals erupted overnight, destabilizing political factions that had relied on secrecy to maintain control. Once powerful figures found themselves indicted, their influence crumbling as public outrage forced systemic reforms. Zalvorn observed as the world's power structures began to realign. The economic reset was working. With corruption systematically eroded and war industries rendered obsolete, the foundation for lasting peace was finally being established. Yet he knew that the most fragile component of the plan remained untouched: human psychology. If humanity did not evolve beyond its predisposition toward conflict, all these changes would be temporary. The system could be manipulated, new forms of warfare could emerge, and the cycle would begin again. The final phase of intervention would not target economies or governments. It would target the way humans thought, the very core of their understanding of conflict and cooperation. Zalvaran turned to his team. The next stage would be the most delicate and the most dangerous, but it was the only way to ensure that the transformation remained permanent. Without a fundamental shift in human perception, everything they had done would eventually unravel. Zalvoran stood before the central projection chamber, watching Earth's slow but inevitable transformation. The architect's intervention had already reshaped the planet's foundations. War had become an unprofitable venture, corruption had been dismantled to a degree unseen in human history, and global economies had stabilized in ways that discouraged aggression. Yet the most dangerous variable remained untouched: human nature itself. No matter how much external influence had been exerted, the instincts that had driven humanity to conflict for millennia still lingered. Fear, tribalism, distrust. These impulses had been refined through evolutionary necessity. The architects could not afford to rely on political structures or economic models alone. If humanity was to sustain its newfound peace, its very perception of conflict had to change. The challenge was profound. Unlike the economic and structural interventions which could be executed through precise manipulations of existing systems, altering the cognitive framework of an entire species required a different approach. Human consciousness was shaped by culture, education, and deeply ingrained biases passed down through generations. To force a shift in thought patterns would risk backlash, suspicion, and eventual resistance. The change had to come from within. Zalvoran and his team had spent decades analyzing neurological patterns across various civilizations, identifying key triggers that influenced behavior on both an individual and collective level. Humans had an exceptional capacity for adaptation, but only when confronted with a shift that appeared natural. The challenge, therefore, was not in rewriting their nature, but in creating an environment where the most self-destructive aspects of their psychology could be neutralized over time. The first phase of the cognitive intervention began with information restructuring. The architects had already adjusted Earth's financial and governmental systems, but now they turned their focus to the institutions that shaped human thought: education, media, and scientific research. Educational curricula across the world were subtly modified, not through direct intervention, but through seemingly organic developments in pedagogy and research funding. Psychological resilience training was integrated into early learning programs, designed to foster empathy, critical thinking, and conflict resolution skills from childhood. Over time, these modifications led to an entire generation being raised with an innate understanding of diplomacy and cooperation. At the same time, the architects manipulated the dissemination of scientific breakthroughs. Research into human cognition, behavioral psychology, and neurological development surged, guiding humanity toward a deeper understanding of its own instincts. As scientists uncovered more about the biological origins of fear, aggression, and bias, new treatments and training methods emerged, helping individuals overcome destructive impulses without ever realizing they had been nudged in that direction. Media networks, one of the most influential tools in shaping perception, were subtly altered as well. Entertainment industries found themselves naturally gravitating toward narratives that promoted cooperation over rivalry, understanding over conflict. Stories of war and conquest lost their appeal, while depictions of unity and problem-solving gained unprecedented popularity. Even journalism, once a breeding ground for sensationalism and division, saw a gradual shift toward constructive discourse. It was not censorship. The architects did not eliminate harmful narratives, but rather ensured that audiences found greater interest in narratives that encouraged sustainable thought patterns. But education and media alone were not enough. The core of human conflict lay in its most fundamental biological mechanism, fear. The architects had studied this emotion across countless species, and in every case it had been the primary driver of violence. If humanity was to evolve beyond war, its relationship with fear had to change. The second phase of the intervention focused on neurological adaptation. The architects had long identified the impact of neurochemical processes on decision-making, particularly the role of cortisol in fear responses and dopamine in social bonding. By introducing trace modifications to global food and water supplies, so minute that no human scientist would ever detect them, the architects ensured that the human nervous system gradually adapted to stress in a way that reduced reactive aggression while enhancing cognitive flexibility. The changes were subtle but effective. Political discourse, once dominated by hostility and distrust, grew more tempered. Public reactions to crises became measured rather than panicked. Fear-based decision-making, which had so often led nations to war, lost its grip on global leadership. Yet, even with these advancements, Zalvorin knew that the intervention was not yet complete. Human nature had been guided in a new direction, but there remained one final barrier: identity. For centuries, human civilization had been fractured along lines of nationality, ethnicity, religion, and ideology. Tribalism had defined social structures, creating an inherent us versus them mentality. While the economic and psychological interventions had reduced the instinct for conflict, the concept of division still lingered. If peace was to be permanent, humanity had to learn to see itself as a unified species rather than a collection of competing factions. The final stage of the cognitive intervention targeted the perception of identity itself. The architects ensured that cultural exchange flourished in ways never before seen. Language barriers diminished through accelerated translation technologies, making cross-cultural understanding effortless. Intercontinental travel became more accessible, fostering first-hand exposure to different ways of life. Shared global projects, scientific endeavors, artistic collaborations, and technological advancements became focal points of human progress, reinforcing the idea that survival depended not on division, but on unity. Zalvorin observed as the final phase unfolded. It was slow, measured, but inevitable. Humanity was evolving not through coercion, but through the careful redirection of its natural adaptability. The seeds had been planted, and though the transformation would take generations to fully manifest, the course was now set. For the first time in history, war was no longer an inevitability. The architects had succeeded. Now they would watch and wait as humanity stepped into the future it had unknowingly been guided toward. Zalvorin stood in the observation chamber, gazing at the vast projection of Earth. The planet had changed in ways no human could ever comprehend. The architect's intervention had been delicate, methodical, and above all, unseen. No wars had been fought to establish this new order. No governing body had declared an era of peace. No external force had demanded submission. Yet, the results were undeniable. Humanity had evolved, not through oppression or coercion, but through the slow, calculated dismantling of the mechanisms that had once made war inevitable. The final phase of the intervention had required patience beyond anything the architects had ever attempted before. War had not simply been prevented, it had been made obsolete. The changes in education, economy, and psychology had already reshaped the way humans perceived conflict, but now the last and most fragile component had to be secured: self-sufficiency. Humanity had to ensure its own peace without ever realizing it had been helped. The architects had seen countless civilizations reach the precipice of peace, only to collapse under the weight of their own instincts. The key difference between success and failure was sustainability. If a species relied on external factors to maintain order, those factors would eventually shift, and the cycle would begin anew. Earth had to reach a point where war was not only undesirable but fundamentally impossible, where every alternative was more beneficial, where every attempt at violence was met with an organic failure. The architect's final intervention was silent and irreversible. Over the years, humanity's systems continued adjusting. Laws no longer relied on punitive measures, but on predictive models that prevented crime before it could occur. Disputes, whether political or personal, were solved through a combination of advanced mediation techniques and a public so well versed in conflict resolution that hostility no longer escalated beyond words. Nations no longer saw each other as competitors, but as essential components of a larger system, interdependent in ways that made betrayal unthinkable. But the true test of the unbreakable system was what would happen when the architects stepped away. Zalvorin issued the final command. The probes that had guided Earth's transformation for decades began their retreat. They did not erase themselves from existence. Doing so would risk suspicion. Instead, they deactivated in stages, allowing humanity to assume full control of its own trajectory. By the time the last of the observation beacons powered down, Earth was functioning entirely on its own. The guiding hand of the architects had faded into the background, leaving nothing behind but a civilization that no longer needed intervention. Years passed, then decades. The architects did not interfere. They simply watched. Wars did not return. Corruption, once the lifeblood of power, had no place in a system that offered no reward for manipulation. Societies flourished under leadership that was no longer dictated by greed or self-interest, but by the simple, inescapable logic that stability was the most profitable path forward. Even as individual conflicts arose, as they inevitably would in any intelligent species, the solutions were peaceful, swift, and permanent. Humanity no longer viewed war as a tool, but as an archaic relic of a past best left behind. Then, for the first time in history, humanity reached beyond its own planet. The first deep space vessels carried explorers, not conquerors. The first encounters with alien civilizations were marked by diplomacy, not fear. And when other species, still trapped in their own cycles of war, sought to bring conflict to Earth, they found something unprecedented, a civilization immune to provocation, indifferent to threats, and most importantly, untouchable. Humanity had become something the architects had only seen in a handful of species before, a self-sustaining force of peace, a society that did not need rulers to dictate its morality or enforcers to maintain its order. It had, at last, evolved beyond war, not because it had been told to, but because the world in which war had once been necessary no longer existed. Zalvorin stood before the projection of Earth one last time. There was nothing left to do. The experiment had succeeded. Humanity had become the civilization the architects had envisioned, not through force, not through revelation, but through the careful, silent transformation of its own systems. And so, as the final architect left the observation chamber, the galaxy shifted, unaware that one of its most unpredictable civilizations had been quietly, permanently set on a new course. The architects had departed. Humanity would never know they had been there, and peace would never be broken again.